I think he judges quite. I don't. I don't think he judged very well the fact that NATO would be so resilient. I suspect he never thought that the states that had hitherto not been in NATO, the Baltic states, Sweden, Finland, those last two particularly, that they would seek to join NATO out of fear. Don't think he foresaw that. No, he's a clever manipulator, an operator, political operator domestically, working his way through, concealing what his plans and intentions were.
Now, Jonathan Dimbleby's latest book may well be about the detail of 1944 and how 2 million Red Army soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front changed the direction of World War II. But it's also a book hugely relevant to today. It draws an important line between a point in history and where we are in the present with the advances of Putin into Ukraine. More on that in a moment. The book also draws on previously untranslated German and Russian sources, many the words of ordinary soldiers, the ones who often saw the most but are heard the least. And Jonathan is with me now. Lovely that you're in the studio with us. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
It's very nice to be with you.
I have to say that in the book, it is that testimony of the ordinary man, and it is a young man's voice every time, isn't it, that really, really got to me. Where were you taking these voices from, and how come we haven't heard them before?
Some of the voices have appeared in other places in small books published a long time ago. The Russian voices in particular have not been heard very much. And for me, they are extraordinarily powerful because you get, all the heroics of propaganda on both sides pale beside the reality that people, as you just said, were experiencing. People expressing frustration, pain, fear, depression, cold, writing letters to their loved ones saying, I hope to see you again, and then not seeing them again. And finding that it was in the archives, but I had a wonderful Russian researcher called Lyuba Vinogradova, who has become a great friend. She's a brilliant historian, brilliant writer, and also loves doing high quality research. So I was very strongly dependent upon her work. I'm afraid to say, having travelled all through Russia in my life, I don't speak a word of Russian, apart from where's the restaurant.
Well, it's good of you to admit that. I mean, I do think it helps tell the story so much, doesn't it? Because as the reader, it pulls you back in all of the time to the misery that was being suffered.
You have to do that. I mean, the overarching theme of the book, which is why it's called How Stalin Won the War, is that the massive preponderance of Soviet force was what really destroyed Hitler's armies, particularly in the summer of 1944, finished them off when 300,000, within a fortnight, 300,000 German troops were surrounded, killed, captured or wounded, which broke the back of the German army. The strength and the certainty, which the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, were well aware of, well before 1944, the certainty was that the power of the Soviets would drive them as far west as Stalin wanted to go. So when you look at the importance of D-Day, which was an astonishing achievement, incidentally, it was important, but it was as important for stopping Stalin getting too far west, had he wished to do so. We don't know whether he would have done so. As important doing that as it was destroying the German army and therefore the defeat of Nazism.
So are you trying to change our narrative of the Second World War?
I think what I'm trying to do, that there's been a paucity of history that looks in... I mean, that's a big book. It's a long book. I hope it's a good read, because if you don't write books that people want to read, you might as well stay at home and, read the books yourself and then go to sleep. I try to write a narrative that takes you forward with a quite extraordinary personal drama at every level. The ordinary soldier, their commanders, the rows, the conflicts, the reality of what it is to make decisions, the tensions between Russia, Britain and the United States, and not least between Roosevelt and Churchill, had a very different view of what the war should be. And yes, I would like people to have a bigger understanding that the Soviet Union was critical to victory. We were ancillary to victory. It's very uncomfortable. Most of the books that have been written tend, understandably, to focus on the Western Front, where our relatives, our grandparents and grandparents fought and in too many cases died. But the disparity of death, if you put it as crudely as that, between the two sides. The Russians in the war, altogether, including civilians, 27 million lives. 9 million of those were soldiers fighting in battle. These are huge figures compared with less than 1 million tragic deaths on the Western Front. So you've got a disparity, and I think it's quite important for two reasons. First of all, to understand the history. Secondly, it does help one understand rather better, I think, the way in which Russia now, Putin's Russia, looks out on the world. And Putin's Russia is deplorable in my book in every single way. There's no redeeming feature, of which the invasion of Ukraine, and oddly I was writing about Ukraine in my book in 1944, in the same towns, the same cities, the same rivers as we've been hearing so much about in Ukraine. But one more important fact is that for many Russian people, leave aside the fact that the media is controlled and therefore it's very, very difficult for them to get any other story rather than the lies that pour out of the Kremlin, there's a deep sense that NATO is a threat, deep sense of NATO is a threat, because the West is a threat. And they're indistinguishable in many Russians' eyes. And also that Russia was once a great empire, a great state. And it was under Stalin, and it was before that under the emperors. And Putin represents a restoration of pride for many Russian people. And that's we don't understand that. It's quite difficult to form, I think, useful judgments. And if we can't understand that he is as willing as Stalin was to throw people into battle, and they've got many more people to throw into battle than the Ukrainians have, and can go on doing it far longer. If we don't understand that, it's quite difficult to make a judgment about what is the possible outcome apart from many more millions dying.
And that's exactly what your book really helped me to understand. This massive, massive loss of life, but because it comes with a sense of patriotism and a sense of heroism and a sense of belonging to a state that somehow can ask that of you, that does help us to understand just how far Putin will be prepared to go. It's not our matrix, is it? No. That's not our way of thinking about a war.
He has, Putin is clever. He's also shown himself to be strategically incompetent, because he genuinely, clearly thought and half believed, I suspect, that he could walk into Ukraine, walk to Kiev, which of course was called Kiev.
Is he clever, Jonathan, or is he just so backed up by power? He's been clever in the people he's surrounded himself with, in taking out his opponents, in being aggressive and silencing people. But is that clever? Is it a clever man?
I think he's astute. I think he judges quite. I don't think he judged very well the fact that NATO would be so resilient. I suspect he never thought that the states that had hitherto not been in NATO, the Baltic states, Sweden, Finland, those last two particularly, that they would seek to join NATO out of fear. Don't think he foresaw that. No, he's a clever manipulator, an operator, political operator domestically, working his way through, concealing what his plans and intentions were, and gradually reaching the point where he was the emperor, which is effectively what his position is. And no one dares say the emperor has no clothes.
What do you imagine his future and his end to be?
Well, I was advised by a very good friend, a great historian, not to take my book beyond the year 2014. It's only the last 5,000 words, because your book needs to be read in 20 years' time. And if you start saying what you think is going to happen and you get it wrong, then people will say, well, the whole book's wrong. Okay. But for you, Fee, I would speculate to this. I don't think he's going quick. I think that everything is uncertain because we don't know what's going to happen in the American election, which is going to be critical in respect of Ukraine. My own feeling has long been that that part of the world has always been states changing boundaries. And Poland's boundary changed at the end of the Second World War. It went 200 miles westwards at Churchill's and Stalin's behest. It's a territory that has always been disputed. And if we just talk about victory, we are deluding ourselves. We may be giving superficial support, but actually it's profoundly misleading. You cannot defeat you can defeat everyone with nuclear war. We can defeat ourselves by nuclear war, but that's not going to happen on neither side, in my view. But there has to be a negotiation, and my suspicion is that in the end, I don't know how much more blood will have to be spilt. And one of you touched early on about the heart-rending stories. And we forget when you hear, I'm a military diplomatic historian, but when you hear some armchair politicians and analysts talking about what has to be done and what will be done, forgetting that there are people there at all, it's all just machines and strategy. You forget the blood and spilt guts, the horror that is in that book in parts, not because I want to bury my hands in the blood, but because we need to know that that is what warfare is like. Now, I don't know how long that goes on, but my guess is, in the end, I don't think the Russians will give up Ukraine. Will give up, Crimea, and I think it'll be very difficult for them to be driven out of the Donbass, the east of Ukraine, where they're so heavily entrenched. So hatred amongst the young, I'm quite certain, in Ukraine, for loathing, much deeper loathing than ever before for Russia, but also not much enthusiasm for going into the trenches to die, and therefore saying to themselves, there must be some kind of temporary solution, even if it's like the north-south divide between the two Koreas. That would be a lot better than a lot more dying.
But you're absolutely right. The scorpion's tail of history will flick back. It always does. It always does in generations. Can we talk about some of the other things in your life as well? Because we're particularly
Depends
keen.
What they are.
Well, they will be.
They are.
They will be about the royal family, Jonathan. Please don't leave the studio now.
What a surprise.
Yes, well, you are a friend of King Charles, and you made, what was at the time one of the most remarkable documentaries with him and a book about him. And I mean, I'm almost loath to ask you this. I think it is so difficult when someone who you know and admire and really like tells you that they are seriously unwell. It brings into very sharp focus how you feel about them, how you see them as a human being. So I wonder how you felt when you heard or you were told, I don't know whether you were told in person, that the king was very unwell.
I knew, and I was very shocked, and like everyone, when they heard about it, thought, what does this mean? How bad is it? How ill is he? I very soon discovered that he is the most, I knew it really, because he's had to be resilient all through his life for all sorts of reasons, that as soon as it was clear that the doctors were saying that he could start doing things again, he was chafing at the treatment. Not very nice treatments, of course. Anyone who knows anything about cancer knows that treatments are not fun. You don't say, oh, whoopee. He always said, whoopee, I didn't wake up in my cot and say, whoopee, I'm going to be king one day. I don't think he said, whoopee, I've got cancer, let's have some treatment. No one does. But he was immediately frustrated because he believed so strongly in the role. So he wanted to go and do the things that this year was what he was going to do, some of which he couldn't do. Mercifully, the relief I know there must have been when he was told, you can go on D-Day to Normandy, told you can do the trooping the colour. These things matter to him both symbolically because he's head of state. These are, if you have a head, don't have a head of state if you want, or don't have an unelected head of state. But if you've got a head of state, there are things you do representing that state. They're important to him in that sense. He also happens to care. I think the D-Day thing particularly. He's been colonel of regiments. He's colonel of the paratroop regiments. He knew these people. He cared about them. He saw them when they came back and went off to operations. He wrote to widows. These things matter to him in a personal sense. He's a person with powerful emotional intelligence and very alert antennae.
You could see just how much people wished him well and really love him, actually. At the garden party, there were some amazing photographs of people gathered around him, just beaming at him, wanting to kind of, give their energy to him. But one of the things that so many people want, Jonathan, is for that family to be a bit happier, for them to all hug a bit more, kiss and make up. And I wonder whether you would be able to give us any insight, obviously it's not going to be very personal insight, into what might happen between the king and his youngest son.
The only insight I can give you is to quote from Tolstoy's first sentence of Anna Karenina.
Damn, I was hoping for something so much more personal there, Jonathan, but give it to us.
Well, essentially what it says is all interesting families have it doesn't say it in exactly these words, all interesting families have tendencies to be dysfunctional in one way or another. You tell me a family that doesn't have dysfunction, I'll tell you a boring family.
Yeah. Do you think they'll be all right in the end?
I don't know the answer to the question.
OK. Can I talk to you about...
Well tried, Fee.
Yes, I did try. I gave it my very best shot. Just missed the top right-hand corner, I think. Can I just ask you for your thoughts also about assisted dying? And I'm sorry to leave this right to the end because we only have a couple of moments' time, and I know it's a subject very, very close to your heart through personal tragedy.
Yes, it is. And very briefly, I strongly support the right to an assisted death for people who are terminally ill and who are of sound mind. I have a great deal of sympathy for those who fear that this is a slippery slope, those with disabilities, for instance. I don't believe that the legislation that I think will, in one form or another, come before Parliament will leave that risk open. I cite only one example in the United States of Oregon, where it's been for a very long time. Legislation will be very similar, I think, to what will be introduced in Westminster Parliament as after the election would be my guess. It has given the right to die to many people on those narrow terms. And I think I'm right, only 1% has actually exercised the right. The right to die is, and it's what my beloved brother wanted, was the right. Not that he was necessarily going to exercise that right. He wanted to have the right. I don't know whether he would have exercised it or not. What I do know is that his life and the life of many, many people have been, are, and will be, unless law changes, diminished by the lack of that right.
Well, I'm sorry to end on such a sad note, but thank you very much indeed for your wisdom and expertise about that. It's been lovely to chat to you, Jonathan, really, really lovely. And Jonathan's book is called Endgame 1944, How Stalin Won the War, and it comes with a hard recommend from me.